All right. Welcome to everybody for this talk, which will be given by Professor Christina Firpo. She is a professor at CSU, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. This talk is jointly sponsored by the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the UC Berkeley Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And today's talk by Christina Firpo is on her new book, which was just published late last year by Cornell University Press, Black Market Business Selling Sex in Northern Vietnam, 1920 to 1945. Professor Firpo is a graduate of UCLA in Southeast Asian history. She's currently a professor of Southeast Asian history. She works in that field more broadly, but she's also a specialist in Vietnamese history, as well as work on women's history and the history of imperialism. Her previous book, prior to the one she'll be talking about today, is entitled The Uprooted Race, Child, and Imperialism in Indochina, which deals with, in particular, the issue of mixed race children in French Indochina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She's apparently, according to her website, working on a new book on women and consumer culture in colonial Vietnam in the first half of the 20th century, which looks like that'll be a great book. So Christina, I'm really looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. It's a really important topic. And I think, Christina is certainly distinguished by the fact that she's identified some really interesting topics to work with. She's found a lot of useful archives to work with, heavy mining in Vietnamese publications, newspapers, and other printed materials from the first half of the 20th century. So all of that is reflected in the work that she's done so far and continues to do, and it certainly is reflected in the book she'll be talking about today. So I'll turn it over to you, Christina, for what I'm sure will be a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for joining us remotely from San Luis Obispo.
I first would like to begin by thanking the Berkeley and UCLA Centers for Southeast Asian Studies. I want to thank Sarah and George and Wiet for hosting this event. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is my new book, The Black Market Sex Industry, the Black Market Business Selling Sex in Northern Vietnam with Cornell University Press. During the interwar years, a busy market for unregistered sex work animated the shadows of Tonkin. Traffickers smuggled women and girls from rural areas to the cities and provincial capitals, from lowlands up to highland, border towns, and to military bases. Min, which were old lady kidnappers, fanned the countryside looking for naive young women and girls to lure into accepting work in the city. They drugged or kidnapped others. Min took women and girls to urban areas for the purpose of selling them to brothels out to Haiphong's port, where they sold them to their victims to Chinese traffickers. Junks dodged the customs officials among thousands of islands dotting Ha Long Bay. Small boats carrying trafficking victims hugged the coast from port to port, all the way to China, where victims were sold to brothels, dance halls, or men looking for a wife. Meanwhile, back in Tonkin, droves of present women and adolescent girls voluntarily set out for the protectorate's urban areas, provincial capitals, border towns, and military bases in search of income. Some stayed only for a short period of time during the harvest, others remained for a long time or permanently. Many of these migrants ended up joining the intimate labor force, whether intentionally or through manipulation and trickery. To avoid ruining their reputations by officially registering as sex work, most worked on the black market. They operated in annexes to registered brothels, out of their homes, in dance halls, and adao singing houses, or in one of the many seedy boarding houses called Nha Sam that sprung up to cater to the sex industry. In the margins of the sex industry was an ultra-secretive market for young girls, underage girls. Some daughters and orphans were sold into the sex industry. In other cases, migrant girls arriving to the city seeking work and shelter were tricked or forced into sex work. Men looking for underage girls surreptitiously approached market vendors, itinerant flower vendors, or rickshaw peddlers, the latter of which played a particularly crucial role in the clandestine sex industry. Clandestine sex workers of all ages crisscrossed the city streets. In the late hours, sex workers hunted for clients from the back of rickshaws. Men hailed rickshaws and then solicited pullers to find them in underage girls. Madams called on rickshaw pullers to transport underage girls to secret locations to meet customers. Sex workers looking to avoid harassment by colonial vice police fled to the provinces. They set up camp near military bases, coal mines, border towns, and train depots to profit from the large male customer base at these sites. Others stayed close to the city, enabling them to access city amenities and benefit from wealthy urban customer base. They moved their operations just outside the colonial governed cities and provincial capitals, forming a ring of illicit sex work in the suburbs. As a result, de facto entertainment neighborhoods developed in suburban areas outside of Hanoi, Haiphong, and the provincial capitals. During World War I, the French colonial government faced a growing threat of venereal disease in Tonkin. Sexually transmitted infections were a matter of major concern to the colonial government, as they could potentially weaken whole military units or result in serious birth defects for children of infected mothers. Authorities identified sex workers as the main source of contagion and implemented measures to slow the spread of venereal disease. The state instituted a strict regulation system imported from the metropole that required sex workers to register with police, pay state taxes, submit to very invasive venereal exams, and if results were positive, be quarantined. Yet the strict rules of the regulation system, which limited sex workers' profit, mobility, and freedom, drove many women to work in Tonkin's black market for unregistered prostitution, which thrived during the colonial period. So I argue in my book that the confluence of economic, demographic, and social changes sweeping late colonial Tonkin created spaces of tension in which interwar black market sex industry thrived. This tension occurred where there was inequality and discord, most of which, in the case of Tonkin, was brought about by colonial policies. These tensions typically occurred in sites of legal inconsistency, cultural changes, economic disparity, rural-urban division, and demographic shifts. Certain designated areas of Tonkin were governed by colonial law, while other areas were governed by Vietnamese law. Venereal disease spread faster than state health services could control. Colonialism brought Western culture and new ideas about the individual's role in the family and society. Landless peasants in the countryside were falling deeper into poverty, while small middle class was thriving in the cities. Cultural changes together with economic disparity intensified the rural-urban divide, and peasants flooded the cities and provincial capitals looking for employment. Such spaces of tension proved fertile for illicit activity. In the interwar Tonkin, sex workers, pimps, madams, and traffickers artfully evaded colonial police by moving between the administrative boundaries separating French and Vietnamese territories. Those infected with venereal disease fled mandatory quarantine. Pimps, madams, kidnappers, and traffickers found their workforce among impoverished peasants and new migrants to the cities. Businesses that were fronts for clandestine sex work, such as dance halls and ada singing houses, marketed sex work to customers who embraced cultural change, as well as to those who preferred tradition. As a nexus of many tensions besetting colonial Tonkin, the black market sex industry serves as a useful lens through which to examine these tensions and the ways they affected marginalized populations. So although sex work is, and especially clandestine sex work, is typically secretive, the secretive nature of black market sex industries typically results in a dearth of historical record. I actually found more than 1,000 cases of heterosexual female clandestine sex work that was covered in 24 newspapers published between 1920 and 1945, or was tucked away in libraries and archives in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Dalat, and Aix-en-Provence in France. I drew from newspaper stories, literature, particularly the rich literature of the Fomso writers, court cases, police reports, public health records, and historians' dream. All these sources were rich and thick description information about how the business of clandestine prostitution operated. The sex industry, first I want to start by saying the sex industry in colonial Tonkin certainly existed before the French arrived. In fact, Micheline Lessard makes a great case for this in her book. I want to look today at a snapshot of the late colonial sex industry that was largely an entertainment-based sex industry. But before I begin my discussion about the clandestine sex industry, I must discuss the state-sanctioned sex industry, which was called the tolerance system, or it was also called the regulatory system. For more information on this, I want to turn to Isabelle Chacon-Hin's outstanding work on the colonial regulated system. The tolerance system developed in Vietnam largely in reaction to the spread of venereal disease. Unlike their British counterparts, the French colonial government did not attach moral panic to the idea of buying and selling sex. The French did, however, seek to regulate sex out of fear of the spread of venereal disease. The belief was that women, and sex workers in particular, were the main source of transmission, and thus their actions needed to be controlled. In the 1880s, as France was colonizing Tonkin, the colonial government established municipal level ordinances loosely based on metropolitan statutes to regulate sex work in Haiphong. Their statute was in 1886, and in Hanoi, and that was in 1888. Yet, like their equivalents in the metropole, these municipal ordinances in Tonkin proved largely ineffective in preventing the spread of venereal disease. By World War I, the French colonial government faced rocketing rates of venereal disease, which was considered one of the colony's top health threats, particularly to the military. French concerns were that venereal disease would render military units inoperable and that the disease could potentially spread to France, where infected troops returned home. Moreover, French and Vietnamese doctors, as well as Vietnamese intellectuals, feared that birth defects caused by venereal disease could lead to racial degeneracy among both the French and the Vietnamese population. So in 1921, to slow the spread of venereal disease, the colonial state adopted a stronger, more uniform legal code that regulated prostitution through the French concessions in Tonkin. The 1921 law required sex workers to register with the state, but its stringent requirements discouraged many sex workers from registering in the first place. The law taxed the sale of sex and required sex workers to submit to regular and quite invasive gynecological exams. And those who tested positive were sequestered in venereal disease clinics until the infection passed, and they lost out on valuable income as a result. Women who were not registered as sex workers but tested positive on more than one occasion were forced to join the police registry of prostitutes. Moreover, once a woman registered with the police, it was very difficult for them to have their name removed from the police registry of prostitutes. A 1926 amendment to the law set the minimum age requirement for prostitution at 18 years old. This 1921 law had many flaws. With its strict regulation, the oppressive nature of the tolerance system drove sex workers to operate underground. The 1921 law created problems in policing. For one thing, it did not actually define acts that constituted as sex work. Moreover, the definition of prostitution used was too narrow, thus limiting actually authorities' ability to police sex work. The law was also only applicable in certain areas because of the treaties governing Tonkin. And so let me turn to those treaties. In 1884, the 1884 Paternotte Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Hue, left Tonkin a protectorate, meaning France claimed it, but the Vietnamese king in Hue was in charge. And Tonkin was governed, at least in theory, by Vietnamese law. In 1888, a royal ordinance placed the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong, as well as military bases and provincial capitals, under direct French rule. And certain sites of industry would also later join as being seen as French land. As one French administrator acknowledged, this system created by these two treaties created not only a municipal, but also, I'm quoting directly, created not only municipal, but also, above all, true national borders between cities and suburbs, because of these two different legal systems. The treaty left Tonkin a messy patchwork of Vietnamese territories and French concessions, and by extension, two separate legal systems. The resulting ambiguity, in turn, enabled for a fair amount of lawlessness. The flaws of the 1921 law and the messy patchwork of Vietnamese territory and French-ruled concessions enabled a clandestine sex industry to flourish. Sex workers aiming to escape the regulatory system set up shop just outside city limits or outside military bases to profit from urban and military customer base while evading colonial laws. Located just beyond the reach of the French colonial government, suburbs became a site of so-called debauchery. The result was, as one French health official put it, a belt of, quote, a belt of Venus that crowns the suburbs of Hanoi and other urban zones of Tonkin. By the mid-1930s, thriving sex industries called entertainment neighborhoods had developed outside of the French concessions of Hanoi, Haiphong, and the provincial capitals, military bases, and sites of industry such as coal mining and railroad junction. In the course of my research, I found that because the state was unable to effectively police sexual commerce using the 1921 law, authorities drew from two discourses of moral panic to police prostitution. The first was the spread of venereal disease, as I just mentioned. In the early 1930s, local laws were passed to criminalize the spread of venereal disease, and this led to new ways of policing colonial sex work. The result was the transfer of a certain amount of power and authority from police, who had limited powers because of the 1921 law to pursue clandestine sex work, to medical industry, to these doctors and health officials who now had the power to intern women in a lock hospital called the Lupsi, and have them registered as sex workers on grounds that they had a second infection. And so it didn't mean you were necessarily caught in the act of sex work. It meant that you were infected twice with venereal disease. And, for some women, that could have just been that their husband brought it home after he had some sort of an affair. But two counts of a sexually transmitted infection left them to be counted as sex workers, as prostitutes. Colonial authorities would use the fight against venereal disease as a means of justifying policing unregistered sex work in ways that had not been permitted under that 1921 law. The second moral discourse used to monitor unregistered sex work was human trafficking. Human trafficking, so the French called it human trafficking, but it was kind of this large umbrella that they used, but I think it's actually better understood under a larger practice of unfree labor. So what is unfree labor? Unfree labor was a large part of the black market sex industry. In fact, it was a large part of the labor industry in general in colonial Tonkin. I define unfree laborers as those who earned no wages or very little wages for their labor. In my research, I found two forms of unfree labor in the colonial black market sex industry, and that's debt bondage and human trafficking. And they were not mutually exclusive. So let me first turn to debt bondage. Debt bondage was common, actually, in many sectors of Tonkin's early 20th century labor force, including among plantation workers, domestic servants, sex industry workers. Debt bondage agreements typically used labor to either pay off a pre-existing debt or to pay off a cash advance given at the start of a work contract. Debt bondage arrangements enabled workers who had little money and no place to bargain, no place to live, to bargain in advance for their salary, for room, and for board. The arrangement thus offered a degree of social mobility for the poor and independence for young women who were looking to start new lives from their families. Workers who accepted the advance payment and or room and board were bound by debt bondage arrangements to pledge their wages to their employer, so therefore foregoing their salary until the debt was paid off. Debt bondage agreements helped impoverished women get a start living independently in the big city while avoiding registering on the police roster of sex workers. Thus, working outside the regulation system meant colonial sex workers could not benefit from legal protection, however meager that may have been. While debt bondage practices were useful for social mobility, they did have a downside. It was not uncommon for those owing or borrowing money to willingly enter into debt bondage agreements with full or incomplete information about the terms of the work agreement they were entering. Consequently, many of those women were left vulnerable in situations of unfree labor. Underpaid or unpaid, they were forced to take out additional loans and tied to jobs that they could not leave, sometimes for years, actually. Some were left in what Rachel Salazar Pereñas describes as, quote, a paradoxical position of coercion and choice. Others were forced into sex work or trafficked. So let's talk about the second type of unfree labor, trafficking. And these, by the way, these pictures here are taken from a 1935 Nainai issue. Nainai was a pretty famous newspaper. And these are pictures of boats that were used to carry trafficked women. And this woman here, she is alive, but this is a picture of a woman who was trafficked, and she was actually dressed, the caption under it was explaining she was dressed in clothes, in Chinese clothes, so that if they're caught by authorities, which eventually they were, authorities would think that she was actually an ethnic Chinese woman returning to China. Trafficked women were typically tricked or abducted and sold against their will to brothels in Tonkin and in China. As Micheline Lessard has shown, the buying and selling of people, and women and girls in particular, has existed in Tonkin since before the colonial era. By the late colonial era, the trade was mainly run by two actors, men and Chinese gangs. Men were old lady kidnappers who preyed on young women and girls in the countryside. In fact, actually, men is kind of mythologized today, and young children today in Vietnam are told, especially in the countryside, are often told, like, if you don't behave, the man is going to come get you. So men were, they kind of lived on in history as this very scary figure of a kidnapping figure, sort of. These men typically drugged their victims. They were old ladies, and they typically drugged their victims and transported them to big cities or to the coast, where they sold them to Chinese gangs that were affiliated with transnational Chinese secret societies. Chinese gangs trafficked women by land or sea to China, mostly to Shanghai, or to other areas of Southeast Asia. Human trafficking was an embarrassment for the French Third Republic government, which prided itself on respect for human rights and its anti-slavery stance. Moreover, the situation in Tonkin received international attention. As slavery was being abolished around the world in the mid-19th century, the international community turned its attention towards rumors of global trafficking networks. Initially, the movement was solely concerned with what they called white slavery, which is the trafficking of white women and girls. And actually turned to Lisa Canestroli is currently writing a great book about this. And they investigated trafficking cases of women and girls in the colony. This movement also identified licensed brothels, including those that housed voluntary sex workers, as the principal causes of trafficking, and condemned France's regulatory prostitution system. So they even said that no matter what the woman's choice was, if she wanted to be a sex worker or not, they deemed her to be trafficked, and said that that the brothels themselves that held those voluntary workers were causing this traffic, or in part causing the trafficking that was happening. Instead of heeding to the anti-trafficking movement's call to end the brothel system, the Governor General of Indochina artfully reappropriated the rhetoric of the anti-trafficking movement to police unfree labor rampant in clandestine brothels. In fact, I'll show you how that played out in a few minutes when we talk about sex work in Adao, singing houses, and in dance halls. So let's turn to the type of sex work I found in the black market in Tonkin. So first, before I get to that, I want to say, though, the types of sex work that I'm going to talk about are not the only types of sex work that were happening, but they were the ones that were most discussed in the primary sources, in the French sources and in the Vietnamese newspaper sources. And this led me to think that either they were the most prevalent forms of sex work, or they were the ones that caused the most moral panic among journalists and public health officials. So I ran with that. So the first I'd like to talk about is adolescent sex work. Juvenile sex work was very much a function of extreme poverty that was endemic to Tonkin in the late colonial period. For the most part, poverty was caused by the colonial economic policy, and it was exacerbated by natural disasters and the Great Depression. Children and adolescents were particularly vulnerable. Some were orphaned when their parents died, unable to afford medical care. Others were abandoned as infants or as children, sold into what their parents presumed was domestic servitude. Orphaned and abandoned children migrated to other parts of the Red River Delta and into cities in search of employment and shelter. Unaware of the common scams and desperate, many adolescent migrant girls were forced or manipulated into performing sex work, or chose to do it as a last resort. So what were the age statutes? I started to mention this earlier in the introduction. Under the French legal code, women were prohibited from selling sex until 21 years old. So because it was the French legal code, this applied to French citizens and only in the French concessions. So mainly it applied to French women. The French started to realize that, well, this has kind of created a racial discrepancy. So they started to change it. Because also they ran into another problem, which is the uneven nature of law throughout the colony. So one example is that there's different codes in different areas, different minimum age codes in different areas of Indochina. So for example, Cochin China set the minimum age of sex work at 18 years old, but even in the city of Saigon, it was at 14 years old. So the 1921 law itself did not address age, but in 1926, they made an amendment to that law to set the legal age of sex work at 18 years old. So what I'd like to talk about now is the market operation for underage girls. The success of the market for underage girls lay in its secrecy. It was decentralized, and it was only open to those in the know. No specific location, like going to, you couldn't just say, I want to find a sex worker and therefore go to an Adao singing house where you knew there was going to be sex workers, or a dance hall where you knew there would be sex workers. There was no single place that centralized juvenile sex work. So you had to be in the know. You had to know who to go to ask for sex work. Instead, juvenile sex work usually occurred in someone's house or in a legal brothel or a boarding house. Managers used fictitious relationships to explain connections to young girls. They posed as parents or family members. They posed as tailors with apprentices, or they said the girls were their domestic servants. Aware that parading young girls on the streets would attract not just customers, but also the vice police, pimps and madams relied on middlemen or women to find clients. Middlemen or women were typically street savvy. They were usually itinerant vendors. In fact, flower sellers and rickshaw drivers repeatedly appeared in my primary sources. And those of you who are not familiar with Vietnam, even if you go back to Vietnam, I guess I'm saying this in pandemic world, but if you go to Vietnam today, you'll see that there's these beautiful flower vendors that roam the streets with freshly cut flowers on bicycles, and they sell them to people. And it's a little dismayed to hear that those were the ones that were the connectors back in the day to the juvenile sex industry. Once middlemen fetched underage girls from their managers, they brought them to clients at boarding houses called Nha Sam, and these also served as a nexus for the underage sex world. In fact, Sean Mallarney does a great job in his book. He did a translation of Vo Chom Phum's Lupsi, and he does a great job of talking about these boarding houses. So now I'd like to turn to two other forms of clandestine sex work that were they were entertainment forms. And these would be Adao singing houses and, Adao singers and taxi dancers. So first, let me talk about Adao singers. It was a public secret in late colonial Tonkin that the art of Adao singing was being used as a front for clandestine sex work. Adao music, which is the ancestor to modern day Kachu singing, dated back in various iterations to the 14th century, and it was associated with the Mandarin class. In the colonial period, however, the reputation of Adao entertainment suffered as the social standing of the Mandarin class declined with French rule, and as Vietnamese newspapers began exposing the link between sex work and Adao houses called Nha Hát Adao, but for an English language audience, I'm just going to call them Adao houses. Adao venues attracted men who were looking for comfort, at least for a night, in traditional culture during this era of dynamic cultural change. On multiple occasions, the colonial government attempted to regulate sex work in Adao houses, but the workers easily evaded the law. These pictures right here, I want to point out, these are pictures of Adao troops. These are not necessarily sex workers, but I wanted to give you that background. Adao singing, for those of you who are not familiar with it, you have a singer who does this beautiful kind of breathy singing, and she hits this fact, which is a stick, and you can see right here, and she's accompanied by a lute player behind her, and here, if you can see my cursor here, you can see the kind of Adao troops behind her. And then this over here is a picture of Cam Tien Street, which I'll talk about in a second. But Cam Tien Street was kind of the nexus outside of Hanoi for Adao singing and also for sex work. Cam Tien Street was destroyed during the Christmas bombings during the Vietnam War. But this is a postcard from the colonial era to show you what it looked like back then. I want to be careful to note that many Adao singers never engaged in sex work, but sex work was indeed sold in Adao singing houses. So I want to focus on that business of selling sex right now. Clandestine sex work proliferated in Adao singing houses because house owners and singers artfully subverted the colonial law. For one thing, Adao singing was not considered sex work under the 1921 law, and singing houses were not brothels. So actually they could not be raided by authorities. The authorities couldn't legally raid them. Singing house owners took advantage of the geographical limits of the 1921 law. They set up these entertainment neighborhoods outside of the city, which was thus outside of police reach, French colonial police reach. The most famous of these neighborhoods is outside of Hanoi. It was called Cam Tien, and that's this picture in the bottom left corner. When local officials attempted to use city ordinances to limit hours of operation or to shutter singing houses, sex workers easily sidestepped the rules by blacking out windows during after-hour parties or ignoring curfews and putting up for rent signs to appear vacant. When police officers tried to force singers to register as sex workers, the singers fled to a different province. Moreover, local authorities who were in charge of policing Adao singers were often their best customers. As Adao singers never sold sex, as some never sold sex, they lobbied the state to stop treating them as sex workers on grounds that they were performance artists. The unfortunate part about giving a talk is you can't get into all these anecdotal stories. And one of my favorite things about studying this project is I just had hundreds and hundreds of these great anecdotal stories of women evading the police, this kind of cat and mouse game. And I bring it up and I use the anecdotal stories in my book, but unfortunately the time constraints of the talk doesn't let me get into those kind of fun stories of, you know, people fighting in the Adao houses that were kind of fun stories to talk about. Authorities were faced with a dilemma. They needed to prevent singers from spreading venereal disease, yet registering them as sex workers would offend women and risk causing them to flee. So they set up a small clinic on the infamous Kamtian Street for them. And this clinic was designed for everybody, but it was specifically targeted, you know, so it wouldn't embarrass anyone. Plus Kamtian there was a lot of venereal disease going on. But the hope was that the singers would go to this clinic and it wouldn't be as stigmatized as, say, for example, the Lupsi, the typical venereal disease clinic. In the late 1930s, colonial authorities drew on laws designed to combat human trafficking and venereal disease. Again, these two discourses of moral panic that I mentioned at the beginning. And they capitalized on these laws on trafficking and venereal disease to police singing houses and circumvent privacy laws that forbade the police from raiding businesses. In 1939, the Governor General also passed a decree to regulate the working conditions of singers and taxi dancers. And I'll talk about taxi dancers in a second. The decree protected singers from human trafficking and exploitative debt bondage contracts. And they used it as a pretext to raid Adao establishments. It also struck an artful balance between establishing anti-venereal measures while avoiding labeling Adao singers and taxi dancers as prostitutes. So now let me turn to taxi dancers. In the mid-1930s, a Western-style ballroom dancing fad took Tonkin's urban areas by storm. While most patrons came to the dance hall for fun and a little flirting, the atmosphere was ripe for selling sex on the sly, and taxi dancers quickly earned a reputation as colonial sex workers. Taxi dancers were pretty young women who were hired by the dance hall to elevate the level of partying, just make it fun and, you know, to be these pretty girls that men would be attracted to. Upon entering the dance hall, male customers purchased books of tickets, which got them one turn of a dance with a taxi girl. They danced to Western style music, including the tango, waltz, foxtrot, and among others. Patrons were young Vietnamese and Chinese, as well as French, African, Caribbean, and Indian men. So this is actually the one spot of these types of sex work that I mentioned here. This is the one spot where it was racially diverse. Adao singing houses were actually very much a Vietnamese space, and the taxi dancers instead, it was a very interracial space for selling sex and just for entertainment in general. Again, not all taxi dancers were sex workers, but today I want to focus on the activities of those who sold sex. Sex works in dance halls exemplified the urban-rural divide that characterized late colonial Tonkin and Vietnam more generally. The success of dance halls relied on an image of urban sophistication and modern style, and thus kind of appealed to those who wanted to modernize. With their Western music and modern decor, dance halls provided a temporary escape from the poverty of colonial Tonkin and the gender norms governing male-female interaction. For one night, patrons could dress up in their glamorous Western clothing and forget their problems while partying the night away in an Art Deco ballroom. Moreover, the purchase of a ticket brought male patrons the chance to dance with, or even spend the night with, the true symbol of modernity, and that was the modern girl, an independent, liberated young girl who was hip to Western fashion and lifestyle. Modern girls embraced Western ideals of leisure and luxury. They rejected traditional expectations on young women, and they were sexually liberal, and many of them sold sex. Most of the sophisticated modern girls who worked in the dance halls were really, in reality, young, impoverished peasant women who'd migrated to the cities looking for extra income. They weren't that image of urban, sophisticated girls who were just eschewing their traditional morals. Indeed, the success of the dance hall model was very much dependent on the countryside. The glamorous image enjoyed by the dance halls derived much of its potency from the contrast between urban and rural life. The dance hall owners capitalized on this contrast in marketing their product. By exploiting the labor, particularly the intimate labor, of impoverished peasant women, dance halls also profited from the economic disparity between city and country. Clandestine work in Tonkin dance halls was the product of two colliding socioeconomic developments, one urban and one rural. In the city itself, which had recovered more quickly from the Great Depression than had the countryside, urban middle-class youth began to enjoy material goods and an abundance of leisure activities. In fact, two great sources for urban culture at this time were Nguyen Din Lap's story, Thanh Truy which talks about this kind of, well, he calls it the depraved youth, Truy, and it talks about these kids who are going out and partying all night and are really materialistic. And then just recently, a great book just came out about the Tuluk Van Duan by Martina Nguyen, and this book is about the self-strengthening group, but it kind of asks us to reimagine what material culture was and the purpose of material culture in the colonial era. And she talks about some of these issues that I mentioned here. Meanwhile, a very different trend characterized Tonkin's rural area, which was much slower to recover from the ravages of the Great Depression. Persistent poverty drove peasant women into the cities and suburbs where many looked for work in the clandestine sex industry. The dance halls, which were seen to be this epitome of urban sophistication and luxury, thus owed their existence not just to Tonkin's economic boom, but actually to the impoverished countryside. As for the glamorous, free-spirited modern girls who served as the primary workforce of the dance halls, well, I found, and they were, these women were the primary attraction for male customers. I found that they were actually, in part, most of the time, an illusion. They were peasant girls from the countryside who were either looking for a glamorous life or were forced by circumstance to make more money and kind of dolled themselves up in this modern gear, these modern clothing. Excuse me, I use modern in quotations, but because that was the term used at the time. But they took on this like modern girl approach to get customers, but in reality, they were impoverished peasants, and these men were looking for what they thought were modern girls. Because the modern girls were liberated, they were sophisticated, they were urban, and they were sexually liberal. They weren't getting these urban girls that they were looking for. It was all an illusion. So now I want to talk about some concluding thoughts. Here's what I found, like some of my findings about the sex industry in general, the colonial clandestine sex industry. The colonial state's blind spots allowed for this clandestine market to flourish. For one thing, officials miscalculated the unintended effects of the strictly regulated tolerance system. As it was too strict with heavy taxes and invasive gynecological exams, difficulty getting difficulty for women to take their name off the register of prostitutes, many of the women went underground, understandably. Moreover, the colonial state had inadequate means of policing these workers. The terms of Tonkin's protectorate status placed geographic limits on the reach of the French law, and the 1921 law that implemented uniform regulations across the French concessions defined sex work too narrowly. The narrow definition, combined with French privacy laws, reduced police powers to pursue leads on clandestine sex work. Moreover, without denying the authoritarian role of the colonial state, it's important to know that in marginalizing certain colonial populations, in this case, Vietnamese women, impoverished Vietnamese women, the colonial state actually lost its ability to control and monitor them. So by marginalizing them, the state lost the ability to monitor and control them. The vice squad could not track the many young women and girls who were slipping in and out of urban areas, whether taking shelter in pagodas, taken in by well-meaning or malicious madams, or forced or manipulated into sex work. Police failed to identify the many rickshaw drivers and itinerant vendors who served as undercover intermediaries for juvenile prostitution rings. Doctors were not permitted to perform venereal exams or quarantine women in the dispensary without reason, though some did anyway. Police and customs officials were largely unsuccessful in their effort to stop kidnappers and traffickers from transporting women to China or to sell them to local brothels. Nonetheless, authorities sought alternative means of restricting the black market sex industry. The Governor General capitalized on two serious concerns at the time, that would be venereal disease and human trafficking. To make the case for policing arao, singing houses, and dance halls, and seedy boarding houses, the colonial they used that discourse. The colonial government also collaborated with provincial governments to institute local level ordinances to impede business operations, including limiting hours of operation, instituting having taxes on entertainment spots, and prohibiting customers from sleeping overnight in the venues. Despite numerous regulations and ordinances, as well as exhaustive policing efforts, sex workers easily sidestepped the reach of the government and found ways to make money in an informal economy. They took advantage of the uneven distribution of colonial power. They dodged colonial regulations by leaving French-administered cities to operate in the suburbs just outside the reaches of the vice squad. When local ordinances imposed restrictions on hours of operation or prohibited men from spending the night, they boldly ignored the law in favor of profit. They skipped town when the police attempted to register them or conduct venereal exams. When local authorities shuttered their clandestine brothels, they simply moved to another location or pretended to have moved and continued to sell sex furtively. As marginal actors in society, being that they were female, unmarried, migrants, runaways, orphans, or victims of kidnapping, black market sex workers were able to operate below police radar and engage in money-making endeavors unencumbered by legal constraints. Yet while their invisibility to the law did afford these women a certain agency, it also put them at risk. Kidnappers and Chinese trafficking gangs profited. These gangs of Chinese traffickers and men profited from selling women and girls. Owners of dance halls and singing houses encouraged and even forced employees to accept extended debt bondage contracts. Pimps and madams often withheld sex workers' salary and brutalized insubordinate women, and venereal infections went untreated, leading to serious health conditions. The stories of the women in these books reveal a close relationship between coercion and choice. Taken individually, it's tempting to reduce these women's experiences to the binary of either agency or victimhood. But placing these stories within this context of a larger historical trends, such as mass poverty, migration, cultural change, reveals that the binary is misleading. And here I want to refer to Elisa Camacholi's work on French sex workers in Argentina. In the case of Tonkin, it's much more helpful to understand Black market sex industry in the interwar years as a place where degrees of coercion and choice often coexisted in a single experience. Some women came to the Black market looking for independence, which they found to some degree. They found this by entering into debt bondage contracts. Indeed, some of them entered into contracts understanding that they would have to give up a degree of freedom in order to gain their long-term independence or to help their family with additional income. Other women were trafficked into the sex industry, but continued to sell sex even when they were no longer coerced. And of course, others were raped and beaten and held against their will. This book follows the case of Black market prostitution into the early years of World War II, when the violence and economic displacement of the war changed the nature of the Black market industry, of the Black market sex industry. So I'm going to turn now to George, and I'm excited to hear comments and questions from you all.
We've already got 4 questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to go straight to those and let Christina handle these in turn. The first question that has been posed asks, is there a Metmin character in the tale of Q, the woman that tricked Q into the beginning of her life of sorrow? And perhaps, you know, you could expand this, your response to sort of address the question of the prostitution and the sex industry that you describe in your book as you hint, has a sort of a history that obviously predates the period you're talking about. So perhaps you could contextualize it a little bit in your response to this question, linking what you talked about to the tale of Q, and not unexpected, I think, reaction to your presentation.
Well, thanks, Mike. It's a good question. Although I'm probably not going to answer it the way you want me to, because I'm going to insist that sex industries are fast moving and they change. They're very dynamic. They change very quickly. And I want to be careful. The reason why I limited my book to a short period of time, 1920 to 1945, was precisely for that reason. Because before 1920 and after 1945, actually, I'd even say it should be a little bit earlier than 1945, the political, economic, and cultural situation, environment changed so much that the sex industry changed quite a bit. So now to get to Mat Min, I want the character that you're mentioning, yes, looks a lot like a Mat Min to me, but I want to be careful to say that there's a lot of time that passed between Kyo's story and 1920. And between that time, there could have been other characters. This image of the Mat Min may not have existed between them. And I haven't done that research between that time. So it's kind of old lady kidnapper who's got bad intentions but befriends you. And in the case of colonial Vietnam, she would give people poisoned candy, kind of in this almost Disney sort of way, Disney Maleficent sort of way. She'd give you poisoned candy, or she'd give you she'd drug you with ether. That certainly existed during the colonial period. I don't know, I haven't done the research before the colonial period to tell you with any degree of certainty that that would please anthropologists, I should say, that the Mat Min did exist at that time in the same form. And similarly with sex work, I want to be really careful. What we're seeing in Cseas was a small snapshot of her experience in the sex industry. And there's so much, because it was such a large time period, there's so much that changed. And I think I would actually argue that, looking at just the case of Vietnam, that sex work changes, the sex industry changes in as short as 20-year blocks. And you can see that from the period I studied to this, for example, the Diem period during after independence, and then into the Vietnam War, and then post-colonial, that Tu Hung Nguyen Va studies, and Kimberly K. Huang. It changes so much that I'm actually a little hesitant to make these comparisons, because I don't want you to see the sex industry as static. I need to emphasize that it is very much dynamic.
Great, thank you, Christine. The next question is a question that addresses the question of taxi dance halls, pointing out that taxi dance halls circulated throughout US empire in the Pacific, specifically the Philippines. Was Vietnamese taxi dance hall culture influenced at all by US empire, or did it come from French empire, or were there other origins of this phenomenon?
Great question, and very fun to study. So the taxi halls did originate in the United States, and they actually at the turn of the century, and then they migrated to Europe. Or excuse me, I shouldn't say they migrated, because they spread to Europe and then all through Asia. So Tokyo had a whole bunch of these taxi dance halls, and then they kind of came to Southeast Asia with music. And so what you'd see with these cruise lines going to the main ports of Southeast Asia, like Singapore and Yangon, and eventually, Haiphong at that point was kind of, and Saigon were minor ports. I shouldn't say minor ports, but in the grand scheme of things, they weren't as big as Yangon or the others. But with those kind of cruise ships, or passenger ships, I always say better than cruise ships. With these passenger ships, the passenger ships had a house band on them. And the house band would often be Filipino musicians or musicians from Europe or something, but mostly it was Filipino musicians that were playing popular dance tunes. And because there were a lot of Europeans on them, that's where you get a lot of these, the tango and the waltz and all that stuff. And there would be ballroom dancing on the ships. And so that ballroom dancing, then when the ship stopped in port, it spread to the ports. And so you see it spreading throughout Southeast Asia with these ports, but then it's also spreading because of music, popular music coming throughout Southeast Asia. And Jason Biggs is actually a great person to look at his research, because he talks about modern music in Southeast Asia. But with the gramophone, with music being sold as commercially as paper music, all this music spread. So the long answer to your question is, yeah, it's being spread from the United States to Europe, and also to South America, where it was really popular in Argentina, and then throughout Asia, first to Tokyo, and then Shanghai, and then to the ports of Southeast Asia.
Great. There's another question here from Michael, but I'm going to bypass that for the moment since he's already asked one. We'll come back to it if we've got time. It's an interesting question, but just in the interest of fairness, let me move on a little bit. So I've got a three-part question here, the parts of which are not entirely related to each other. The first question is, do you know why the 1921 law didn't address the maximum age while the 1926 law did? Should I ask all three, Christina, or do you want to?
Yeah, I've got it in front of me, so I'll.
Okay.
Why don't you go ahead and read it, and then I'll.
Yeah, I'll read the others. Yeah, so the second question is, were there any changes concerning sex work during Vichy France? For example, more Japanese customers or Japanese customs that infiltrated the sex work? And the third question is, how did black market in Tonkin differentiate from other parts, for example, Cambodia? Is there any geopolitical factor there? Were there in regional areas seen as less professional sex work and more concubines? Right, so
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so these are all terrific questions. 1921 law, so I can tell you the reason why it was brought about in the 1926 kind of amendment to this law was because they realized that there was a racial discrepancy, and also women were going between, they were catching sex workers who were underage. So these were voluntary sex workers who were underage in the provinces. Say, for example, I'll give you the Cochin China example. Even though I studied Tonkin, I'm going to give you the Cochin China example because this is the origin of this law. They were catching sex workers who were in the provinces who were older, who were 18 years old. Where the age limit was older at 18 years old, and those sex workers they were younger girls who wanted to work, so they were going into the cities younger than 18 years old, and they were 14 years old where it was permitted. And there was also traffickers who were taking young girls into the city selling them to these brothels where these were legal brothels where the women could participate. So that's where the origin of the change came from. How did the 1939 French decide to protect them relate to situations of France and in the EU? I think a lot of that, the 1939 law, this is coming about in the midst of the high point of the Third Republic and the Popular Front government. And there's this great study done in 1937 called the Guernsey Mission, where they investigated all the social problems of the colony. In fact, it's a great source for graduate students looking to write for sources for their dissertation. I used it in both of my books. But they looked at everything, like all the major colonial problems. Like I used it when I studied Eurasian children, and I also used it for sex workers. And so they were looking at kind of these problems facing sex workers and the sale of sex and the clandestine sex work. Oops, I'm sorry, I lost your thing. Okay, there we go. And so I think a lot of this came out of the Popular Front, as well as this intense pressure on France to answer to not the United Nations, but the precursor to the UN, to answer to them about the existence of their regulatory system, whereas the international movement against trafficking really wanted France to shut down the regulatory system. And then this person asks, were there changes concerning sex work during Vichy France? More Japanese customers or more Japanese customs. So Frédéric Roustan has studied the role of the Japanese in the sex industry. In fact, I think it was around 1905, maybe 1910. I think it was just after the Russo-Japanese War. I have to go back to my notes to remember. Actually, they kicked out all the Japanese sex workers. And then the question is, were there more customers? I didn't see Japanese customers in my primary sources. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. It's just I didn't see any mention of them. Were there changes to sex? I'm sorry, the third question is, how did it differentiate from sex work in other parts of the empire in Cambodia? And is there a geopolitical factor? I can't answer the question of Cambodia. I didn't research Cambodia, and I haven't seen that much work on Cambodia. True Jacobson wrote a great book that talks, she kind of does all of Southeast Asia, but she is a Cambodia specialist, and she kind of did a long swath, I think like 300 years of time, when she talked about the sex industry in Southeast Asia. I'm sorry, it isn't the sex industry, it was trafficking in Southeast Asia, but there really isn't much that I have found, secondary sources that are really digesting the sex industry in colonial Cambodia. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question well enough.
Okay, the next question lies a little bit outside of the scope of your book, but Larry Ashman asks, how is the situation with non-Vietnamese sex workers, in particular French or non-Asian women? So perhaps did you come across things incidental to your book project that you could say about that?
Yeah, I did. Since I was looking mainly, the sources that I was looking at were Vietnamese. I was really focusing on the Vietnamese sources, and then also some French sources. They did mention French women who were sex workers. And again, I'm going to turn to work by Jennifer Boiten, because she's a French scholar who's looking at French women who are involved in sex work. And she actually, to go back to the Cambodia question, she looks at French women who are in Cambodia. I did see French women in the documents from the French. It was far and few between, but I actually think it was more common than what I was seeing. And I think it was just a big secret that the French didn't want to see them, especially the French. I did find one document where the French were particularly upset about French women who were seeing Vietnamese clients. And I did see quite a bit about Eurasian girls. And I addressed that in my book, and I also addressed it actually in my previous book.
Great. Now we've got a question from Peter Zinnemann, and a question that was also sort of going through my mind as I was reading your book. He says, the last decade or so has witnessed the emergence of scholarship that captures something about the mentalities of Vietnamese sex workers during the Vietnam War, Mylan Gustafson's work, and the post-Doi Moi era Kimberly Huang's work. I'm wondering if you uncovered any sources that shed light on the colonial era mentalities of the sex workers themselves, and in particular, how they viewed their own participation in this kind of work.
Okay, excellent question, Peter. And I think you'll appreciate this response, because so the answer is no. I found very little from the sex workers themselves. My main source of primary sources in the Vietnamese language stuff was coming from newspaper articles and a lot of the Phomsa writers. And I think that a lot of the reason, well, I did find some stuff. Like I opened a chapter with a letter, a very snarky letter from supposedly from sex workers into a newspaper that was, it was this great letter that was using sexual innuendos to talk about how the authorities that were the very authorities who were trying to police them were actually their customers, and that how they kind of took a slice of their body and would eat them. I mean, this is a beautiful letter. And I have other letters from other writings from women who were accused of sex work, or I actually do have quite a bit from young girls who were, they were on trial, or excuse me, the girls weren't on trial. They were part of a trial of against human traffickers who were caught, human traffickers or people who were caught trafficking juvenile sex workers. But the girls that I heard from who were testifying at these trials had the mentality of they themselves had been tricked into sex work. As far as the newspaper articles that I have that are kind of these snarky newspaper articles, they were signed by women and possibly had the snark of somebody like Vo Ucham, to be honest with you. That's why I said you might appreciate this. So the answer is no. And that's why I didn't focus my book on the viewpoint of the sex workers themselves. I was more looking at the business of selling sex and this clandestine, like I was really interested in informal economies. And so how did they hide this stuff? So I didn't have, I couldn't find a lot of the sources from their viewpoint to talk about those mentalities in the way that Kimberly K. Huang was able to do so.
Okay, the next question is from Data Dokot, who asks, did Southeast Asian men use the taxi dance halls, or were they segregated or reserved for particular groups in some fashion?
Oh no, they were very much interracial, and there were a lot of fights, actually, like racially based fights between Southeast Asian men. So I saw Vietnamese men in there. I saw a lot of Vietnamese and Chinese men in there. But I also saw a lot of soldiers from the French Empire, French men, Métis men, African soldiers, Indian soldiers. I mean, it was the gamut. And it was so striking to me when I started research on the dance halls, because it hit me how other places like Arau venues were not actually as integrated. So this was very much integrated with dance halls.
Okay. The next question is from Anh Winton, who asks, I'd like to ask more about the Vietnamese wives of French soldiers. Why did Vietnamese elites and French government officials associate them with sex work and venereal diseases?
Oh, excellent question. And I say that I'm excited that you asked that because it combines my two books. My first book was on Eurasian children who were taken from their mothers by the French colonial government. Sometimes it was voluntarily given, they were voluntarily given, other times they were not, it was not voluntarily. But these children were often the children of women who were wives or girlfriends of French colonial soldiers. They were French soldiers, African soldiers, and whatnot. So in fact, I should probably write an article combining these two books to explain this. I found in my first book, I found a really interesting file on the wives of soldiers being forced to register as sex work, even though these women, and they were writing in to talk about, to protest this, these women themselves, before living with a French soldier, they had to go through a vetting process by the French military. And that vetting process was to kind of prove that they weren't sex workers and to make sure that they weren't, bringing back venereal disease back to their husbands. So it's kind of, I don't want to say that Ochampfum was wrong when he was writing King E Leite, because I think he was actually, I have so much respect for him and his research. But this was kind of the opposing idea. And so these women were writing in and saying, we are not sex workers. But that same file where the French government was trying to register wives of soldiers as sex workers, they were also trying to, because these women were accused of being sex workers, they were trying to take custody of their children. And these were half French children or half African children, which the French colonial government had a lot of interest in taking custody of them. And I go into this in my first book. It was for various reasons, but one of them being that they wanted to raise them in a French environment. And I could go on for hours later about why that was the case. So I think a lot of their attack on women, the French government's sort of attack on women who are either married or girlfriends of soldiers, came from their desire, taking away their maternal rights. And of course, some of them were sex workers and were spreading venereal disease amongst the soldiers. But I think a lot of it has to do with the Eurasian children.
Okay, great. We've got another question from Ron Bird, which is wondering whether you can address the degree to which judicial punishment was meted out to people who were apprehended by colonial authorities for their engagement in sex trafficking.
Yeah, okay. So I think the French actually tried really hard to apprehend, this is traffickers, not necessarily brothel owners, or not necessarily illegal brothel owners where women are voluntarily trafficking, or taxi hall owners, dance hall owners, or at our houses. So I'm going to set those aside, and I'm just going to talk about traffickers, and in particular juvenile trafficking. I think the French actually tried pretty hard to apprehend people and to punish them. And I go into the different layers of punishment. It depended a lot on the age of the victim, but the French they couldn't catch the traffickers. The traffickers were, like, the brilliance of trafficking came from loosely organized networks of partially lone wolves, and that would be the men, who would meet up with the Chinese gangs that were themselves loosely organized, but part of Chinese secret society. So there's this loose organization to it, or I should say it's decentralized. The decentralized nature made it really hard for the government to catch them, and they would go by junk ships and even small boats, like hugging the coastline that just looked like small fishing boats. Before the era of the big police state that we have now, it was pretty easy to evade authorities. However big we seem to think colonial government was, in some ways, it was too big to find the little guys, and that's where this was coming from, the little guys.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of questions from Michael Van, and I'll pose his earlier question first. Was there ever any concern about political security issues amongst French authorities related to the brothels? Did they fear that these might be sites of revolutionary activity? And then he links it later in his question to were Japanese brothels a source of concern in Tonkin, or Chinese brothels that might have been linked to the GMD?
Okay, this is a good question. Again, I'm going to refer to Frederic Cloustan, who talks about Japanese especially he talks about the Japanese population in Indochina, and he does have he's got an article published in the JVS about Japanese sex workers. the majority of them were kicked out before the time period before World War II. I'm sorry, before World War I. So I don't see a lot of them in the sources. And then as far as brothels as sites of revolutionary activity, I didn't find anything about that. I'd love to find something because that sounds fascinating, but I didn't see anything in the primary sources. I'm sorry.
Okay, then Michael's got another question. Was there a sense of the movement of venereal diseases or STDs in the French documents? And he asks, I'm wondering if the infrastructure of empire moved STDs around Southeast Asia as it did with cholera and plague. Did French troops, legionnaires, and or colonial troops bring disease to Tonkin?
Oh yeah, and in fact, actually the 1921 law came about because, so I love that you are bringing up this sense of movement, especially nowadays. When we talk about movement of this virus. Yeah, there was actually, it was kind of cool to see that sense of movement. The 1921 law came about because of World War I. The troops were coming back from Europe, and they're basically being moved all around the empire. And some troops who were stationed in Southeast Asia were now going back to France, and they really feared that with this huge movement of this mass movement of troops that these STDs these BDs, venereal diseases would spread more quickly around the empire. And that's actually why the 1921 law came about. And then did French troops, legionnaires, or colonial troops bring disease to Tonkin? So I can't talk about what the first origin of venereal disease was, if that's your question. I have a feeling because of your medical history background, you're probably not asking that question in particular. But did troops come in with disease? Hell yeah. I think the colonial state vilified women, but the men in uniform may have been a more crucial vector to the spread of disease. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's exactly correct. And I mean, this is something that it's kind of a theme that I found throughout the book, especially when talking about something I didn't get into in today's talk, but throughout this time period that I studied, there were multiple discussions about whether or not to set up. So there were these informal entertainment villages. They were trying to figure out, should we set up red light districts? And what I always found so interesting was the question about setting up red light districts was this fear that if you set up red light districts and you're co-locating women, and they did have ideas of doing that, but this fear that if you're co-locating brothels, then venereal disease would spread more quickly. But what's kind of silly about that, if you think about it, and I hope I don't get too graphic or offend anybody, but what's silly about that is most guys can only have sex once in a night. And so it's not like they would have sex in the village and then go to the very next brothel next door and give it from one to the next to the next to the next and give them venereal disease. Instead, they had to go home and give it to their wives and then come back. And so this idea that co-locating was so dangerous, which co-locating would actually have been a very helpful for business. And in fact, that's what they ended up doing informally. But yeah, it's this kind of notion that they saw women as being the problem, whereas men were also were basically the ones who were spreading venereal disease too. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we've got another question from Zuhung Witten, who says in Adao, there are rules to protect the singers from the audience or sex pyres. The Dandai, a lute player, is always male, often singer's father or brother. Can you share any cases that you came across that found that Vietnamese women were able to protect themselves from the trafficking market in any fashion?
Yeah, actually, I was able to interview an Adao, a woman who sang Adao. She sang it in late 45 and then into the 40s and then stopped as Adao kind of was frowned upon by authorities and local governments after independence were shutting down the houses. But she actually mentioned exactly what you're saying, that the singers, so there were two types of singers. I have to be careful not to oversimplify this, but journalist, I think it was Swansea who had identified them as two types of singers. He kind of set it up as this bad girl, good girl binary. And so that's why I want to really hit hard that the singers, not all singers were sex workers, but there was sex work going on in there. And so the singers who were not sex workers were oftentimes from the provinces, and they were trained really well by local Adao singing groups. And I think that's where you get to these rules that protect them. And they were really serious singers. A lot of them they could be young girls as young as 8 years old. And and they were brought in, and it was like their husband, their father, their older brother, who were like the lute players and whatnot, who were protecting them. And I think they were protecting them because there was this sex work that was happening. This is again in the colonial period, not earlier, and I don't want to speak about later, but because there was this sex work that was happening. And so there were these girls who maintained that they didn't engage in sex work. And then there were girls women, who did engage in sex work in there. But I want to be careful not to, you mentioned here, how were they able to protect themselves from the trafficking market? I want to make the distinction between the trafficking market and actually voluntary prostitution that happened in there. And to say that it isn't, I say distinction, but it's not a hard distinction because there is this continuum. In fact, some women sold sex every night, and some women just sold it once in a while, and some women just did it once out of desperation. So there wasn't really this bad, even though Swanzio tried to make it into bad girl, good girl, it wasn't really that hard of a definition. It was more of a continuum. And I also hate the idea of bad girl, good girl, but it was more of a continuum. And yeah, there were these girls who didn't engage in sex work. They were there just to sing, to perform their art, and also make money performing their art without sex, if that answers, if I could get to the heart of your question.
Great. I don't see any more questions that have been posed. Hang on. Wait, there is one. Sorry for another question. Were there any mentions of male sex workers or males having sex with males? I think you addressed this briefly in the beginning of your book, Christina, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit for the audience.
Okay, so Richard Chan wrote an awesome dissertation. I think he's making it into a book. He's a Berkeley grad, actually. And he was able to find some of this information in his sources. I was able to find very little of it. I found reports by the French that were talking about male sex work because, okay, so I really wanted to get this into my book. I wanted to look at, I also wanted to look at, homosexuality amongst the women in the sex work, as well as male prostitutes and whatnot. For the life of me, I couldn't find it in the sources. I found a few anecdotal cases, and primarily in these taxi dancing places, because that happened to be a place where there was a lot of military. So we know that it did happen because I found references, and Richard found references, and he actually was able to go into it in more depth in his dissertation, which is going to be a book soon. But I don't have that large primary source base of it, and I really wish I did.
Did it ever come up in the sort of French governmental discussions at all? I mean, was this sort of as a sidestepping, sort of homosexuality in the ranks kind of thing?
Oh, I found a lot of it. I found a lot of mention of it, but not particular cases of it. That's the thing. I wasn't finding the actual cases of it. I found like the French had all these like crazy ideas about how people could evade they would like eliminate homosexuality from the military by bringing in sex workers. And they also said that by bringing in sex, a lot of the soldiers, according to the French, a lot of the soldiers were trying to avoid venereal disease, so they would have sex with each other. And the French, and that was a big reason why the French wanted to stop the spread of venereal diseases, so that their soldiers would not have sex with each other. And so it's kind of homophobia that is in the background, and this idea that they thought that the mere presence of a woman was going to stop men from having sex with other men, which I kind of thought was funny. And they thought that men were having sex with other men just because they wanted to avoid venereal disease, when they just might have liked men. Was my impression. But I didn't have enough of these cases of the actual stories of the hard specific cases. It was more French talking about this, about alluding to it.
So speaking of venereal diseases, did you to what degree does sort of venereal disease treatment or ostensible treatments of venereal disease factor into any of the story that you're talking about here? It's obviously part of the kind of larger kind of commercial availability of ostensible remedies and so forth. So does that factor into any of the kind of dynamics here in terms of, the ways in which this, it could be resolved?
Well, okay, so part of the reason why I also ended in 45 is because the war changed the kind of entertainment life of Tonkin, and it created mass migration, but two, because that's when antibiotics were discovered. It was discovered that antibiotics could treat venereal disease. And as a result, it changed the French relationship with sex work. But at the same time, there was this whole other law that was being passed in France, and people were rethinking the brothel, this kind of closed brothel system at the same time. But so as far as treatments before the antibiotics came along, I mean, they were terrible. Thank goodness none of us existed at this time and had venereal disease, because first of all, the French they didn't have the ability, the science to figure out what, like, to kind of differentiate between the different venereal disease. The venereal trident that they identified was syphilis, gonorrhea, and cankers. And those are three very different microbes, very different pathologies. And there were three different organisms that you're dealing with inside of a woman's vagina or on a man's penis. And the French, though, lumped them together based on the way that they were spread and the environment in which they were spread, and not sexual contact for the most part. Now, they were also spread through birth, but through sexual contact. So as a result of lumping them together, and at times not even being able to identify the difference of them, because, like, for example, syphilis can be really hard to identify without being able to do medical treatment for it. And in some cases they were able to put them under the microscope and see it, but come on, out in the countryside they couldn't do it. And so as a result, they couldn't treat them individually. They often treated them kind of as a lump sum. And then they did all different kinds of things. I go into the medical part of this in my book, about how some of the treatments that they used they were toxic to the kidneys. And actually, my dad was a real saint during my research, because my father used to be a nephrologist, and I would call him up and ask him about the ins and outs of venereal disease and how the treatments affected the kidneys. But sometimes with some of these treatments, you were lucky if the treatment venereal disease didn't, we didn't know who was going to kill you first, this venereal disease or the treatment. And venereal disease takes a long time to die, but these treatments could be pretty toxic. And so because they couldn't really treat them that well, you constantly had people coming back in either with reoccurring cases or just one long case of venereal disease that just would descend into syphilitic mania.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. It doesn't look like we're getting more questions, but here's a last chance if anybody wants to pose one. But in the meantime, let me express my thanks both to you, Christina, for a fascinating talk. I strongly recommend people to pick up a copy of her book, because the talk is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more in this book that I think is really important to read, and it's really quite a fascinating story. So definitely worth your time for sure. And also thanks to all of the questions that were asked. I think those provoked a really good and lively discussion here, expanding nicely on the talk that you gave, Christina. So seeing no other questions, thank you to everybody who joined us today for this talk co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the UC Berkeley Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And thank you again to Christina for a terrific talk and for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, George and Sarah, for organizing this and for reading my book and whatnot. And to all of you, thank you for your questions. They were fantastic.